Hi everyone. It's a pleasure for me to welcome you all. My name is Asim Latif, and I'm working with INEE as Distance Education Coordinator. So I'm excited to welcome you to the launch of our background paper, which has particularly been compiled considering the needs of distance education and education in emergencies context. So let's begin, and we hope along the way more people can join us. So next slide. Yeah. So just a brief introduction about the Distance Education Working Group. Previously, it was known as Distance Education Reference Group. And the working group was primarily, you can say, formed considering the needs of the distance education aspects right after the COVID-19 pandemic. And basically, the group has two objectives, which are to produce, curate, share guidance and knowledge on distance education. And the second one is to advocate for quality, safe, relevant distance education solutions, considering the fact that we should leave no child behind, especially the most vulnerable and marginalized youth. So the distance education working group is being co-chaired by Diana Willis and Leah. So the three of us have looked after the group, and this is one of the resource which the entire group has worked upon. So they are also with me to welcome you all. And last but not the least, Rachel McKinney. She's the thematic areas team lead at INEE, and she looks after the entire work at INEE, other than distance education, which focuses on gender inclusive education. I'll be dropping the links to the work of distance education working group in the chat, so you can visit other resources. And for other thematic areas, the wonderful resources which we put together, they're all available on our website. And I'll also like to mention that our partners are joining us today, Altamont Group. They've worked with us to develop this wonderful resource. Sajda, she's the Chief Executive Officer who has led and managed the project, and Colette, she's the lead consultant and author, and Elizabeth Bruce, she primarily focused on mapping and compiling the distance education database. So before we jump in, I would request Diana to say a few words about the resource.
Well, I just want to welcome everybody as well and thank Asim and my co-chair, Leila, and everybody at INEE for the work that we did together and the whole work group, as well as Sajid's team. And for those of you who know this process, you know this is a little bit like herding sheep, so or cats, as somebody had a cat on the screen before. So I'm going to leave it to the team to talk about the document, and just again to recognize the amount of work that went in and the number of opinions. And I just want to pose a question to us to take away from this that isn't exactly stated in the working document, but I think one of the things that we struggled with and still struggle with is, what do we mean by distance education, number one? You know, what are the implications of it being with technology and not with technology? And I think we need to think about that. And I think the second thing is the question of distance education as a standalone idea, or distance education as something that we all need to integrate into our thinking, regardless of the working group. And just to direct your attention as you consider these larger questions, not only to this report, but a report that came out from UNESCO about the new social contract, and I think it's called The Future of Education. And I'll drop that link in chat later. But I think the work raises as many questions as it answers. So it fundamentally provides some essential resources right now that should be helpful to practitioners in the field. And it also, I think, raises questions for us, or should raise questions for us, of what does distance education in emergencies look like as the world is changing around us. And so I just wanted to bring this larger question, which nobody knows the answer to, but Sajid's team certainly tried, and I think achieved, a document that should be useful to practitioners. So I thank you all for being here, and I'll turn it back to Asim.
Thank you, Diana. So over to Sajda.
Thanks so much, Asim, and thank you, Diana. And truly, it was an honor and a privilege for Altamont Group to be working with INEE to help develop this background paper. And Diana, you've raised some really salient points. In addition, I think the other element to consider, obviously, is our end user, our end beneficiary, because we know that the teachers require support, we know that the administrators require support, and the policymakers, but we should never forget the ultimate beneficiary. And so that's something else I think to keep in mind as we look at the evolution and the changing needs of the situation within emergency education. So thank you again for being here, for inviting us to be here, and it's a pleasure. As you can tell, my voice is not so good, so my colleagues Elizabeth and Colette will take us through the agenda. Primarily, we're going to spend about 40 minutes walking through the document and talking about the background, the development of it, the objectives and the structure, and then we'll focus on our findings. And as Diana and Asim have both mentioned, it was a collaborative effort. We worked very closely with the DRG, incorporating perspectives. We interviewed various stakeholders, and we'll share some of those perspectives and findings with you. And then we would also like to have some time for Q&A. So Colette and Elizabeth will walk us through the overall document, and then we should have about 20 minutes of Q&A. And so I'll just go to the next slide, please. So this paper was part of a bigger assignment, I would say, wherein, we wanted to make sure that we were looking at things holistically, particularly in the wake of COVID-19. So obviously we were commissioned by the Interagency Network for Education Emergencies, INEE, under the auspices of the INEE Working Group on Distance Education and Emergencies, which is DEWG. And as mentioned, the paper was authored by Altamont Group. So Colette was the primary author, and Elizabeth not only mapped, but also supported very strongly with editing. And we really wanted to focus on usable and user-friendly tips and ideas and strategies that could be implemented immediately by the various stakeholders in the field. I'll now turn it over to Colette. Next slide, please.
Okay, thank you, Sajida, and thank you, everyone. Welcome. And as we speak about the approach of developing this background paper, Altamont Group and INEE Distance Education Reference Group would like to acknowledge the very helpful contribution and sincere efforts and valuable time given by DERG members, especially Asim, Dr. Diana, and Leah in the process of developing this background paper. And the development approach adopted was a participatory and collaborative process, and we tried through this process to engage all members, all DERG members, in every phase of the process, and the design and inception phase, which included a consultation workshop with DERG members, the resources collection and mapping phase, which included a survey that was distributed among the widest network of DERG members of mapping, and this survey tried to collect and map resources. And the next phase was the consultation phase, which included 21 KIIs, key informant interviews with experts and practitioners of distance education in emergency situations. After that, we developed the background paper, which included also reviewing document, writing the background paper, and documenting all identified resources and the mapping matrix. And the last phase was the review and edit phase, which included also rounds of feedback from DERG members, followed by necessary updates of the paper report. Next slide, please. What the background paper offers. The background, this background paper include lessons learned, challenges, and best practices collected from many resources and from the opinion and experiences of consulted key informant interviews. And we will present in the next slides the structure and content of the background paper. The paper stresses on the importance of setting and offering distance education interventions that are based on principles and that are compliant with the INEE minimum standards, while adopting the minimum standards and the intervention based on the intervention's specific context and learners' conditions. So, and we stress on the inclusion and equity in offering distance educations, which are key guiding principles for education in general. And this background paper calls for their application across all education modalities, including distance education. Next slide, please. Okay, so it is okay. The background paper also offers useful ideas. We try to gather as many useful ideas as possible, and we offer these useful ideas from different contexts with examples and actions, either for planning, offering, or monitoring and evaluating distance education in emergency situation. We offer also in this background paper background information and definitions to promote further clarity for different users. And we also try to gather and present evidence-based recommendations focused on 3 areas: capacity building for teachers and distance education. And the second focus area is educational technology. And the third is enabling policy for distance education in emergency situation. And we will speak also about these 3 strategies later on. So next slide, please. And I give the presentation over to my colleague, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Colette. While this paper does offer insights as to challenges, opportunities, and lessons learned, and most applied practices, it also offers guidance tips around the 3 focus areas of distance education strategies, which Colette outlined: teachers' capacity building, technology for education, and enabling policies for distance education in emergencies. Additionally, it offers 300 plus resources which were mapped and are available on the INEE website to support with distance education in emergencies. Next slide, please. With students at the heart of the education ecosystem, this paper is intended to be useful to formally employed teachers as well as those who offer informal support. And this was a group that was repeatedly mentioned during our consultations as part of the COVID-19 response and the important role these informal education actors played. Also, it's meant for national and local education authorities, as well as those outside of this ecosystem with influence. And this includes education and education in emergency practitioners, researchers, consultants, influencers, community-based organizations, for example, parent-teacher associations and school-based management committees, donors, NGOs, INGOs, humanitarian, development, and education sector actors, and the private sectors, including the for-profit and ed tech firms. Next slide, please.
Okay, so we're going to speak now about the structure of the background paper. The structure of the background paper include an overview, strategies in line with the 3 focus areas, and each strategy section includes challenges, lessons learned, and best practices, and is concluded by a checklist. All checklists which exist at the end of each section have the same structure and present suggested task according to 5 phases process. The 5 phases are readiness, planning, implementation, transition to blended or face-to-face learning, and monitoring and evaluation. Next slide, please. Okay. And as we said, that all checklists which are at the end of each section have the same structure and format. And they present at the first column. They exist in 4 columns, in a table of 4 columns. At the first column, they propose a process of 5 phases, as we said: readiness, planning, implementation, transition to blended or face-to-face learning, and monitoring and evaluations. The second column presents suggested task, or which is a sub-phase, which are like sub-phases of the initial phases, 5 phases, and include must-do tasks, which are suggested in the paper. The third column includes tasks, ideas that are considered as nice to do if practitioners would like to apply or to consider, while column 4 presents useful resources for each phase. And sometimes the same resource apply to more than one phase, they are not just limited to one phase. So this is for the structure of the checklist. Next slide, please. The background paper also has 9 annexes. And the annexes include definitions of key terms used in the area of distance education, useful resources, resources to structure a distance education intervention. And I want to stop at the useful resources, which can be found in the mapping matrix, or they are now uploaded on INEE website, and we can provide the link also to these resources in the chat. Resources to structure a distance education. This is the third annex. The matrix, as I said, a minimum standard guidance table. The INEE minimum standard guidance table, and tips specifically for teachers in distance education. So if teachers are consulting this background paper and are seeking tips on how to apply distance education, they can go immediately or directly to the annex tips specifically for teachers in distance education. And there's also another annex for tips for applying different distance education modality, which also different users who wants also to design, plan, or implement distance education modalities can consult directly also. There's an annex on gaps in offering quality education. And the last one is the list of interviewed experts and practitioners throughout the process of developing this background paper. Next slide, please.
As we all know, the world was a laboratory of multiple learning modalities during the COVID-19 pandemic, as governments rushed to ensure continuity of learning during this time. TV remained an important vehicle for distance education, while nearly 50% of countries still relied on take-home packets to circumvent challenges arising from a lack of electricity. Next slide, please. Our consultations highlighted technology as an enabler of online distance education in 2 distinct yet frequently complementary ways. For one, it can be a delivery mechanism, like a truck delivering materials and equipment, and as a tool to support the activity of learning, as with a paintbrush, that when used by someone who is skilled in painting can produce a beautiful picture. Next slide, please.
Okay. Among the major, as we said, that the background paper tried to gather as much as possible useful ideas for practitioners and for people who or stakeholders who would like to plan or provide the distance education in emergencies. So among the major lessons learned from the different experiences across countries in the provision of distance education, we can mention that a provision of remote learning solution does not in itself automatically ensure usage by learner, especially young age learners, which who have specific needs and who needs like maybe more follow-up from teachers and parents, learners with limiting context conditions, like learners who can't access internet, don't have electricity, who are living in a conflict zone, different limiting context conditions, and learners with disabilities. Also, among the lessons learned, we found that the government faced numerous challenges as they transitioned to distance education, such as limited institutional capacity to support teachers, poor access for vulnerable populations. So there's many areas which can be accessed during COVID-19, and lack of coherent policies and funds to support distance education. There was also a lack of school and university readiness, including the maintenance of academic rigor and social emotional well-being during the acute stage of emergency and remote teaching. Next slide, please. And as the background paper stresses on the importance of the provision of quality distance education, we also acknowledge that distance education as part of education, as Dr. Diana said, may not have a single universally accepted definition of quality education and subsequently of distance education. However, there's common components that provide or ensure quality education or quality distance education, because it's a part of education. So there's no single internationally accepted definition of quality education. And however, the common components are cognitive development of the learner and education's role promoting values and attitude of responsible citizenship and or creative and emotional development. And also the background paper also invites to consider the education in the process of facilitating learning on the acquisition of knowledge, skills, values, beliefs, and habits. Then quality education includes appropriate skills development, gender parity, and provision of relevant school infrastructure, equipment, educational material, resources, scholarships, and teachers. Excuse me, I have connection problem. So quality criteria account to all modalities of education, not only for distance education. Criteria stated in the INEE minimum standard regarding quality of education in emergencies include affordability, accessibility, gender sensitivity, responsiveness to diversity, and these are the quality also distance education that the background paper stresses on. It's also, we need to mention that it's not the education that differs, it's the modalities that differs, but the quality should remain the same and should follow the same criteria and main components. Next slide, please.
So the INEE minimum standards and the principles for digital development provide the globally recognized and referenced guidance on education and emergencies, as well as the implementation of technological approaches broadly. This applies whether education is in person or whether it's a distance approach. Next slide, please. As I'm sure many of you know, the INEE minimum standards for education are the global framework for delivery of quality education in emergencies. And these standards are organized according to 5 domains. The foundational standards, which include coordination, analysis, community participation, access and learning, environment, teaching and learning, education policy, and teachers and other educational personnel. Next slide, please. You are likely already familiar with the principles for digital development. As we said, these are not specific to education, but are related to digital development broadly speaking. Next slide, please. The website for these principles outlines how to apply them in practice according to different phases of the project lifecycle. These phases are analyze and plan, design and develop, deploy and implement, and then cross-cutting, monitoring and evaluation. Next slide, please.
Okay. Online education is one of the modalities of distance education. There's 2 modalities of distance education. It might be an online education or an offline education. For the delivery of distance education, the challenges of online distance education, and among these challenges, because we cannot mention all of them here in the presentation, among the challenges documented for the online education modality, we present 3 types of challenges: connectivity, pedagogical challenges, and social challenges. For pedagogical challenges, the principle associated with the lack of support of training for both teachers and students to ensure universal quality distance education. Such support needed include, so there's a lack of support or there's no support, ensuring an engaged presence of teachers and an integrated interaction between the students and teachers. And the presence and interaction are what differs distance education from correspondence education. Developing the digital fluency of teachers and learners and the digital pedagogy, curating content from the abundance of online resources, and sometimes it's not curating, it's developing content with the scarcity of online resources in languages different from the English language. And we have also the connectivity problem, which is mostly related to unreliable or of internet connection. And in addition, many students lack necessary electronic devices. Also, there's a threat of increasing digital exclusion for vulnerable learners. Next slide, please. And the last challenge for online distance education is social challenges, which include a lack of human interaction between teachers and students, as well as among students themselves, difficulty in assessing progress in students' learning, and lack of physical spaces at home to receive lessons, lack of support from parents, and even if parents are willing to support their children, sometimes they don't have the capacity to do it, maybe educational capacity or psychosocial capacity. Parental resistance to distance education because it's sometimes a new idea and or they have their own ideas of distance education. Next slide, please. Elizabeth.
So a number of challenges arise from offline distance education. Pedagogical materials really have to be in place before learners can access it, and it's not often immediately reliable whenever they're using, as they are when they're using online distance education. There's often a lack of available adapted curriculum, a lack of available printed materials, the worksheets, workbooks, stationary materials that they need to practice new skills. A lack of updated context-related information to determine the best low-tech intervention to be adopted, so that information to know how to best tailor approaches to reach students. A lack of monitoring of learner participation and progress. As Colette mentioned, there's often a lack of literacy, numeracy, and academic skills among parents and community members, as well as a lack of positive perceptions around whether distance education can even work. Finally, and this was something that came up multiple times in our interviews, is the risk to teachers. And this includes their own personal security. And the same is true for learners and communities, which can make distance education actually very challenging and potentially dangerous for them. Next slide, please. So, to enhance distance education effectiveness, our recommendations focus on meeting the short-term needs of both educators and learners while still looking forward and putting those plans into place that will enable reaching medium and long-term goals. These recommendations center around applying an inclusive, collaborative, and participatory process with support for students and teachers, including through strong collaboration and partnerships with key stakeholders that can promote and nurture the rapid development and scale up of remote learning modalities. Next slide, please.
To improve EdTech integration in distance education, we recommend to increase the access potential for EdTech, especially for the most vulnerable, including girls, young women, and learners with disabilities, as well as for women who are teachers. We also recommend to provide EdTech with a combination of online and offline components, allow for meaningful two-way interaction between students and their teachers. This is part of ensuring quality education, and seek guidance from EdTech integrating models such as summer TPAC and the community of inquiry frameworks. Next slide, please. To improve teachers' capacity building and distance education, our recommendations focus on teachers delivering online education should, because there's also recommendation for teachers delivering offline and online distance education. For teachers who are delivering online education, distance education, they should get opportunities to practice technology operations, like how to use tools such as camera, Zoom, Moodle, understand the capability and benefits of particular tools and how to use them, identify the pedagogical methodology to be used, the recommended ways of mixing them, and when and how a technology tool is used, or they are complementing each other. For teachers delivering offline distance education, they should follow knowledge and skill understanding of how to select a learning channel or modality, which means one-on-one or going door-to-door to drop off papers and collect them and give feedback, or to work in small groups of 5 to 10 students meeting in person, understanding of how to design micro or bite-sized learning curriculum so it's short and attractive with clear instructions for learners to be able to learn independently with minimum support, and understanding of how to provide constructive feedback to students.
As far as recommendations for improving distance education policies, key themes are do no harm as well as leave no one behind. This means expanding each modality, operationalizing a combination of inclusive learning modalities, applying various mechanisms to mitigate learning loss, thinking outside the box for teacher recruitment, remuneration, and working conditions, and paying particular attention to addressing the needs of refugee learners. Next slide, please.
Finally, we chose to conclude by presenting the main recommendations of the background paper. And we recommend, we recommend to support the recovery and return to face-to-face learning, apply equity considerations in financing education policies and programs, provide mental health and psychosocial support for both teachers, students, and even for parents, set the decision-making level for distance education inside institutions who are delivering distance education and at the government level, integrate EdTech and national policies on distance education, promote EdTech that strengthens support to teachers, parents, and caregivers in their roles, ensure continuous quality capacity building for teachers. And this means the capacity building should be pre-service and in-service, while teachers are working with necessary professional development pathways and support. There's specific recommendations for ministries in particular. We recommend to ensure the provision of infrastructure conditions for distance education, to define and support a policy for learning and teaching in displacement and emergency situations. So this is all for presenting the background paper on distance education in emergency situations. And now we open the floor for questions and answers, and back to Asim.
Thank you so much, Colette and Elizabeth, for a very comprehensive presentation. So yeah, if you guys have any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat or using the Q&A function. And perhaps I can start and ask a question to Diana. Like one of the areas which was really new for me while we were developing this note, and we launched the process of literature review, was the digital fluency, the term itself, digital fluency, and how it's different from digital literacy. And it was quite interesting to know the importance of digital fluency, and we should consider it the need of the hour. So perhaps, Diana, you can highlight some of the aspects and how people generally confuse fluency with literacy and what needs to be done within the distance education landscape in this regard.
Sure. I'll just say it in a general way. And there's a lot of opinion about this, but I would say that in some way, literacy is a minimum standard. So if you think about digital as a language, and if you have literacy in a language, it means you can generally comprehend and speak in that language. If you have fluency in that language, I think it means you have more of a cultural understanding of that language and a cultural understanding of that language in context. You may speak Spanish, but there are a lot of Spanish speaking countries. So how you speak that and how you use it and what it means culturally. And what we're trying to do in this report, and I think Sajid's team captured this, is to say it isn't enough to prepare teachers to use digital materials or engage digitally. There is a way that the culture of working digitally works. And so when teachers, if you're just moving a course from offline to online and you're doing exactly the same thing, but you're doing it online, and that's because you're digitally literate, you can make that transition. That's not the same as being an effective teacher in that context. So I think when you think about literacy and fluency, to think about it in language terms and what it means to be a literate Arabic speaker and a fluent Arabic speaker. And there's plenty of place for discussion and argument in that. The point we're trying to make with fluency is that it's a bigger issue than just a command of an alphabet or of language elements. It's understanding how to work in that space effectively. I don't know if that helps.
Thank you so much. And so Claudia has asked a question. The floor is open, anyone who wants to answer. So she's saying that we understand that the best thing to do is to return to face-to-face education, but can we continue to recommend this in contexts of violence, insecurity, and poverty, where the education center is far from home? And perhaps we can also couple this with one or two other observations, which is that distance education as an aid to the face-to-face normal conventional model. So yes, where there's violence, insecurity, how do we ensure that distance education ensures continuity of education, but especially in aspects where formal education is being provided, how can distance education, especially with the advancement of educational technology, support and reinforce, you can say, face-to-face learning? So anyone who wants to answer?
Okay, we'll start by Claudia's questions.
Sure.
When there's a conflict or insecurity, and by definition, it's part of emergency situation, I think it's part of the emergency situation. And it's up to the people who are planning or designing the intervention for education to decide on the modalities they would like to apply to ensure this security and the safe education for all learners and teachers. So it's up to the people who are designing and presenting the education, and by the end, distance education as a modality, and we recommend face-to-face or blended education whenever there's no threats on life or any other threats on learners and teachers. So this is a part of combining between distance education and face-to-face education, and which is the correct time to apply only face-to-face education. For other questions, Elizabeth, would you like to answer?
Yeah, speaking a little bit more to Asim's second part of the question, I think one of the things that was really underscored to us is, we think that so many children, they have the technology skills, that they're ahead of us as adults with technology and that sort of thing. But I think it really was reiterated to us that while they may have certain skills that relate to technology, they don't have many fundamental skills that are useful as far as the education piece, but then will go on to be very useful to them in work and in life. For example, they may be excellent at TikTok, but they may not be so great at like an Excel spreadsheet and that sort of thing. And we can't forget that there are some really fundamental skills that they also need to work on, and that it was important to have that. It can really be a benefit to have that technology piece still as part of education, even if we're able to go back to face-to-face learning. And just to add onto something that Diana mentioned when she was talking about the fluency literacy, something that came up repeatedly too is really creating a safe space for teachers to be willing to try new things and to potentially not be successful, and that to be okay, and to support teachers in dealing with that, because it's never fun for us to fail. But if you ever learn to speak a new language, you have to try it out and you won't do it right the first time. But so on that spectrum of moving from literacy to fluency, it really came across in our interviews that it doesn't have to be a success every single time they're in the classroom, just by trying something new, and they should be encouraged to do that. And they should be supported when they come back amongst other teachers to share these experiences and realize that they're not alone in this, because there's some benefit in failure.
Perfect. Thank you, Elizabeth. So we have a second question from Gregory, and he says if we can highlight the difference between distance education and distance learning, like what term should be used in which contexts. And his second question is related to the feasibility on the use of digital technology, other multimedia such as recorded video and audio, like any good practices in terms of distance learning.
Okay,
so
I will answer this question.
Sure.
Distance education and the resources and experts we consulted use distance education and distance learning sometimes for the same meaning. But if you want to differentiate us from the question, you mean if distance learning means like learner are getting education through distance. So, and which tools you can use or which tools are feasible. The usage of tools, as we were speaking, depends on developing a certain digital pedagogy and digital fluency skills for teachers. And also you need to seek to contextualize how you use the tools and when you use the tools. For example, if you want to use video while your students or the learners don't have any equipment that receive or have connectivity to receive videos, is useless to use videos. While videos and short videos, they were like among the good practices during COVID-19 distance education for learners in refugees camps in Lebanon, for example. And short videos were sent to them through WhatsApp. So there's many examples, but it's always dependable on the context, what the users have, what are the conditions they are learning in, and how you can also, if the tool is really transmitting pedagogical messages you want to transmit. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you. And we have another question for you, Elizabeth and Colette. Has your work looked at some of the factors that deter people from using available distance education platforms? She says sometimes employers in certain institutions discriminate against people from certain distance education institutions. What do you think could be done to diminish this disadvantage faced by individuals that are from distance education institutions?
So I think one piece of this goes a bit to the quality assurance and accreditation aspect of this and making progress in that area. So because as we mentioned, even at the youngest ages, there's the sometimes negative view of even parents as to, is this distance education even effective? So we've got to get over that hurdle, whether you're at the youngest ages or up into like higher education and even on into lifelong learning. So I think there's some policy needs around the accreditation and quality assurance approaches, and also being kind of advocates for what is being done and kind of showing the innovations that are possible and really some of the advantages that can come through distance education and those approaches, and really putting those forward to advocate for the institutions themselves.
Yes, and we can add also that the background paper invites teachers and learners to be part of support groups. Teachers can be part of peers groups or any support groups, professional groups in their areas, so they can advocate for their rights, or they can request any adjustments or work for negotiate adjustments beside the institutions or other parties. So I think this is always people need to speak up and search for solution, and they can be part of peers groups or to try to advocate, as Elizabeth said.
Thank you, Colette. And perhaps we can just take one last question quickly, and perhaps Diana, you can very briefly answer. So one of my colleagues, Lauren, she's looking after gender work at INEE. She has asked, what recommendations do you have for addressing gaps in access to technology, distance education opportunities for marginalized learners, such as displaced girls and learners with disability? How can we make sure that distance education is reaching all learners and not just those with access to technology and time to study?
Yes, I mean, I think one of the things is looking at going back to the INEE standards on equity. I think INEE lays out a pretty good roadmap on what needs to happen for inclusion, equity, and diversity. And I would also say add to that justice. And I also think we need to empower the learner. So one of the things in terms of the technology is if they don't have data bundles, and this is a thing I know a lot of people have faced, who are on this call and work internationally. And, we think if we get the connectivity and we have the internet, that's somehow going to enable people in the refugee camps to be able to use the internet. And so somehow either in grants or funders, we have to make sure that there are data bundles for the technology, or in the face-to-face and some of the work we've done at the Center for Professional Learning. If you're going to take teachers from refugee camps and bring them someplace central to train them, you need transportation money, you need security to get them to the training site. There are some very basic things that we can do to contribute to equity, inclusion, and diversity. And I think that that's, and related to that is, and as I'm talking about it is, so what's the ecosystem that's impacting that single learner? So if they don't have a data bundle and they don't have a phone and they're a girl and the only person in the family who has the the device is the oldest brother or the father. I mean, what are the micro changes we can make? Because we can't change the whole system, but we can make sure that a learner is equipped. But we need to look at the whole ecosystem and say, we need a data bundle here, we need a safe space, we need bus transportation, we need lunches. And I know that sounds very mundane, but when you're actually doing it, those are the things that hang you up. So that's my off the cuff answer.
Yes, if I may
Thank you,
add
Diana.
also, thank you, Diana. So if I may also add, the background paper also suggests to assess the needs in the area, and whenever vulnerable people are identified, they need also to be reached, not only through distance education, to be reached by other means before offering distance education to them, to identify their specific needs and how they can be responded to.
And just to build on what Diana said too, it really is important. It emerged from our findings to really dig into the mundane, or what may seem mundane. Even when it comes to scheduling, like let's say if you have a television program, really taking into account what does the daily life of the people who need to access that learning look like. Are they having to take on childcare responsibilities at that time? Is there a possibility to offer some flexibility if children, are having to do other things during the time that a program might be offered? And also, just really paying attention to, as Diana said, it's not enough to just count devices. You've got to really dig into the data and understand who in that household where that device is actually has access to it. When do they have access to it? How long do they have access to it? That's where some of that micro learning that Colette covered in her slide comes in, because it may be that learning is going to take place in little bursts throughout the day, but that doesn't discount that learning's happening.
And it's especially also if it's culturally accepted that the learner access the device or learn through the device and appear on through digital education platforms. So this is also an additional aspect, and these are also aspects that needs to be covered through the assessments before offering any distance education modality, and to be for the distance education to be really contextualized according to the learner's conditions and to the context conditions.
Thank you, Colette, Elizabeth, and Diana, for a very comprehensive answer. So it's been a pleasure. I think we have reached the time limit. I definitely don't want to end the discussion here, but it's been a pleasure, and you'll get the recording via an email link. So please do share the recording for the webinar. And I hope you review the background paper in detail. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach us through the Distance Education Working Group page. Relevant emails are given there, or you can just email INEE. Thank you, and we look forward to welcoming all of you to the launch of our upcoming more resources relating to distance education. Thank you,
everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.